Hello and welcome to Lesson 6.1B. I've entitled this video, Adams versus Jackson. This video is going to cover pages 337 to 347. Democracy expands. In the early 1800s, American democracy was a social outlook as well as a political system. Most Americans did not feel that the rich deserved special respect. Wealthy European visitors to the United States were surprised that servants in American households expected to be treated as equals. Others were amazed that butlers and maids refused to be summoned with bells, as in Europe. Alexis de Tocqueville. A visitor from France, Alexis de Tocqueville, became especially well known for his observations on American democracy. He came to the United States in 1831 to study the American prison system. For several months, Tocqueville toured the United States. However, he observed much more than prisons. He observed a society that was becoming more and more democratic. After his return to France, Tocqueville recorded his experiences and observations in a book titled Democracy in America. In it, he admired the American democratic spirit and the American goals of equality and freedom. He also observed that while Americans expected to be treated as equals, equality only went so far. But overall, he found that the results of the social revolution taking place in America, while still far from coming to an end, were already incomparably greater than anything which had taken place in the world before. Increased suffrage. During the 1820s, or the early years of the age of Jackson, more Americans gained suffrage, or the right to vote. Others, however, were denied full participation in the growing democracy. The United States was growing rapidly. New states were joining the Union. This growth fed some of the sectional divides among states over taxes, trade, and other interests. People in the North, South, and West differed in their views on these issues. Despite these disagreements, the regions grew more alike in their eagerness to expand voting rights to nearly all white men and to strengthen democracy. There were many citizens eager to participate in elections. Some of the first states to give voting privileges to white males who did not own property were in the West. In these states, any white man over age 21 could vote. Reformers in the East worked to expand suffrage in that region. By the 1830s, most eastern states had dropped the requirement that voters had to own land. In this way, laborers, artisans, and craft workers and shopkeepers gained the right to vote. Throughout the country, growing numbers of Americans exercised their newly acquired right to vote. Before 1828, the turnout of eligible voters was never more than 27%. That low percentage rose to nearly 58% in the election of 1828. By 1840, voter turnout was nearly 80%. Limits on suffrage. Despite the nation's growing democratic spirit, a great many Americans did not have the right to vote. These included women, Native Americans, and the vast majority of African Americans. Meanwhile, even through Jackson's presidency, a few states kept the requirement that only white male property owners were eligible to vote. Although most white men had won suffrage, free African Americans had lost it. In the early years of the nation, most northern states and a few southern states allowed free African American men to vote. By the 1820s, however, many of these states had taken away that right. By 1830, only a few New England states permitted free African American men to vote on equal terms with white men. In New York, African American men had to own property in order to vote, while white men did not. No state allowed enslaved African Americans to vote. And here's a picture, once again, of the election of 1824. Notice that Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, and he also received more electoral votes than anybody else, although not a majority. The corrupt bargain. No clear winner emerged from the election of 1824. Jackson won the popular vote, but no candidate won a majority or more than half of the electoral votes. As a result, under the provisions of the Constitution, the House of Representatives had to choose the president from among the top three candidates. Because he had finished fourth, Clay was out of the running. As Speaker of the House, though, Clay played an important role in influencing the results. He urged members of the House to vote for Adams. After Adams won the vote in the House and became president, he named Clay his Secretary of State. In the past, Secretaries of State had often gone on to become president. Although the election was decided properly according to the Constitution, Jackson and his backers were furious. They accused Adams and Clay of making a corrupt bargain and stealing the election from Jackson. The anger of Jackson and his supporters seriously hampered President Adams's efforts to unify the nation. The presidency of John Quincy Adams. Adams perceived that the outcome of the election had angered many Americans. To, quote, bring the whole people together, he pushed for a program of economic growth through internal improvements. His plan backfired, however, and opposition to him grew. Promoting economic growth. Like Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay, Adams thought that the federal government should promote economic growth. He called for the government to pay for new roads and canals. These internal improvements would help farmers to transport goods to market. Adams also favored projects to promote the arts and the sciences. He suggested building a national university and an observatory from which astronomers could study the stars. Most Americans objected to spending money on such programs. They feared that the federal government would become too powerful. Congress approved money for a national road and some canals, but turned down most of Adams's other spending programs. Origin of new political parties. During the 1820s, nearly all politicians were members of Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party. In the 1830s, however, new political parties took shape. These parties grew out of the conflict between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. The Whig Party. Democratic Republicans who supported Adams and his programs for national growth called themselves National Republicans. In 1834, many of them joined a new party organized by Henry Clay and known as the Whig Party. Whigs wanted the government to act to help the economy. They wanted the federal government to promote business by paying for roads and canals. They also wanted the federal government to oversee banks. They believed that a stable banking system would encourage business. Whigs also wanted higher tariffs. Tariffs are taxes or fees placed on imported goods. Because tariffs make imports more expensive, they help domestic producers. However, they may prompt foreign governments to counter with their own tariffs. This can harm exporters. The Democratic Party. Jackson and other Democratic Republicans who supported him began to call themselves the Democratic Party. Today's Democratic Party traces its roots to Andrew Jackson's time. Like the Whig Party, Democrats also had a point of view. They called for more political power for ordinary white men and opposed privileges for the wealthy or educated. Democrats were opposed to a federal government role in the economy and to tariffs. Democrats opposed high tariffs because farmers counted on being able to sell their goods overseas and did not want to risk retaliatory tariffs. Tariffs also protected American manufacturers from foreign competition. The result was higher prices for all kinds of goods that ordinary people needed. Democrats supported westward expansion to open up more land for frontier settlers. Democrats were generally more tightly organized than Whigs. Members usually followed the directions set by party leaders. Who supported the Whigs and Democrats? The Whigs had their strongest support in the Northeast, while some supported in cities and towns in the South and West. People from these places backed the Whigs because these places relied on manufacturing and commerce, and Whig policies aimed to help those parts of the economy. Whig supporters included Eastern factory owners and other businessmen, some Southern planters, and many former Federalists. Whigs were often divided into factions, and not all of the party members always followed the party's direction. Democrats had strong support in the South and West, especially among laborers, artisans, and small farmers. These groups also supported Democrats in some parts of the Northeast. Small farmers and workers supported the Democrats because Democrats spoke up for them against bankers and Northeastern businessmen. While big business favored the Whigs, middle-class business people and merchants lined up behind Jackson. A bitter campaign. In 1828, Adams faced an uphill battle for re-election. This time, Andrew Jackson was Adams's only opponent. The campaign was a bitter contest. Jackson supporters renewed charges that Adams had made a, quote, corrupt bargain after the 1824 election. They also attacked Adams as an aristocrat or member of the upper class. Adams's supporters replied with similar attacks. They called Jackson a dangerous military chieftain. If Jackson became president, they warned, he could become a dictator like Napoleon Bonaparte of France. We call this kind of negative campaigning mudslinging. Jackson won the election easily. His supporters cheered the outcome as a victory for the common people. By common people, they meant white people who worked for a living, including farmers and city workers. For the first time since the Revolution, the politics of the common people were important. Jacksonian democracy. Jackson was a new kind of American politician. Unlike the polished aristocratic Easterners who preceded him, Jackson was a plain-spoken frontiersman. His personality and point of view would influence American politics for years to come. Andrew Jackson growing up. Like many who admired him, Andrew Jackson was born in a log cabin on the frontier. His parents had left Ireland to settle in the Carolinas. Both died before Jackson was 15. Consequently, Jackson had to grow up quickly. Although he was lean, he was a strong fighter. A friend who wrestled with him recalled, "I could throw him 3 out of 4, but he would never stay throwed." Always determined, Jackson showed his toughness at 13 when he joined the American Revolution. He was captured by the British while carrying messages for the Patriots. And here we see a picture of what happened to him when he refused to clean the officer's boots. Jackson prepares to be president. After the Revolution, Jackson studied law in North Carolina. He later moved to Tennessee and set up a successful law practice. Over time, he became very wealthy by buying and selling land in Georgia and Alabama. While still in his 20s, he was elected to Congress. He served for just a few years before becoming a judge and a major general in the Tennessee militia. Jackson won national fame for his achievements during the War of 1812. He led American forces to a major victory over the British at the Battle of New Orleans. He was also known for his leadership during the Creek War. A group of Creeks, angered in part by white settlers moving into their land, began to attack settlers. These Creeks massacred at least 250 people, including soldiers and their families, at Fort Mims in present-day Alabama. Jackson led an army to stop the attacks. His victory at Horseshoe Bend forced the Creeks to give up vast amounts of land in what we now call Georgia and Alabama. Andrew Jackson was a complex person. He had led a violent and adventurous life. He was quick to lose his temper, and he dealt with his enemies harshly. When he became president, his opponents sarcastically called him King Andrew. Jackson intended to be a strong president by expanding the powers of the presidency. At the same time, Jackson's supporters admired his ability to inspire and lead others. They considered him a man of his word and a champion of the common people. Jackson's inauguration. As Jackson traveled to Washington to be inaugurated, large crowds cheered him along the way. For the first time, thousands of ordinary people flooded the Capitol to watch the president take the oath of office. After Jackson was sworn in, the crowd followed the new president to a reception at the White House. One onlooker described the scene with amazement. From a primary source, countrymen, farmers, gentlemen, mounted and dismounted, boys, women, and children, black and white, carriages, wagons, and carts, all pursuing Jackson to the president's house. The crowds were so huge, the observer continued, that the president was almost suffocated and torn to pieces by the people in their eagerness to shake hands. Jackson's critics said the scene showed that King Mob was ruling the nation. Amos Kendall, a loyal Jackson supporter, saw the celebration in a more positive way. It was a proud day for the people. General Jackson is their own president. Causes of Jacksonian democracy. Andrew Jackson was elected in 1828 largely because white men without property could now vote. He drew much of his support from small farmers, laborers, artisans, and middle-class businessmen on the western frontier. The spread of political power to more people was part of what became known as Jacksonian democracy. However, Jacksonian democracy was limited to select groups. In particular, Jackson owned slaves at his estate, the Hermitage, and opposed the anti-slavery movement. Effects of Jacksonian democracy. Jackson was the first Westerner to occupy the White House. His election marked a shift of political power to the West. He was seen as a daring individualist. His image helped shape an American consciousness focused on individual freedom and daring. Another effect of Jacksonian democracy was the growth in political parties and in citizen participation in the political process. It was one thing to make it legal for nearly all white men to vote. It was another thing to convince them to vote. Jackson's Democratic Party introduced political campaigns that appealed to common people and their concerns. These campaigns motivated white men to cast their vote for the Democrats. The spoil system. One of the biggest effects of Jacksonian politics was the development of the spoil system. Spoils are loot or plunder. These spoil systems was the practice of awarding government jobs to friends and supporters. As one Jackson supporter explained the system, to the victor belong the spoils. After taking office, Jackson fired many government employees. He replaced those employees with his supporters. Most other presidents had done the same, but Jackson did so in a much larger scale. Critics said the spoil system was corrupt and unethical. They accused Jackson of rewarding his supporters instead of choosing qualified men. Jackson replied that giving government jobs to ordinary men would prevent a small group of wealthy men from controlling the government. He felt that most Americans could fill government jobs. The duties of all public officers are so plain and simple that men of intelligence may readily qualify themselves for their performance, he said. Well, thank you for watching, and I have a political joke for you. What's the difference between baseball and politics? In baseball, you're out if you're caught stealing. Thank you, and have a nice evening.